It began with a question that lingered in his mind longer than most, an echo that refused to fade no matter how many times he tried to silence it. He had always been the sort of man who played by the rules, who waited his turn in lines, filled out forms honestly, and kept receipts neatly folded in his wallet. Yet life, with its endless complications and quiet injustices, had begun to whisper in his ear that perhaps the rules were not written with people like him in mind. Perhaps the system itself was a sort of game, one that was rigged from the start, and only fools believed otherwise. The first time he bent the rules, it was almost innocent. He had parked his car in a spot reserved for permit holders only, fully aware he had no permit but also fully aware that the street was empty and no one was harmed. When he returned to find no ticket on his windshield, he felt not relief but a rush of something sharper, almost intoxicating, like discovering that gravity itself could be defied if only one dared enough to test it. It was not a crime in his eyes, not really just a moment of bending a rule that seemed arbitrary. Yet that single act planted a seed in his thoughts. When is it wrong to cheat a system that feels unfair, and when is it merely survival? He carried that question into bigger matters. At work, he watched colleagues who cut corners rise faster than those who followed the manual. Reports were padded, expenses exaggerated, hours claimed, but never worked. They did it openly, shamelessly, and still walked away with promotions. He told himself he would not stoop to that level, until one day, faced with a rent bill he could not pay, he quietly adjusted a spreadsheet in his favor. No one noticed. No one even checked. And for the first time in months, his bank account could breathe. The guilt came later, softer than expected, drowned out by the louder voice insisting that the company was a giant machine, wealthy beyond measure, and if the machine couldn't feel his small theft, did it really count? Soon he began to notice how often people justified their own cheating. The man who slipped a second handful of fruit into the one-bag-only offer at the grocery store. The student who copied homework answers from the internet because the assignments were meaningless. The woman who lied about her income on an application to qualify for financial aid. Each act was small, often defended by necessity, by frustration, or simply by the belief that the rules themselves were dishonest to begin with. He began to wonder if morality was less about obedience and more about context, about who wrote the rules and who suffered from them. His father had lived a life of strict honesty and yet had died poor, weighed down by debts he could never clear. His uncle, a sly man who always knew how to slip a coin past a tax collector or how to bribe an official with a smile, had built himself a mansion. Both men had stories told about them at their funerals, one about loyalty, the other about cunning. And he, standing in the space between their legacies, wondered which path truly deserved admiration. Was it nobler to die with integrity but empty pockets, or to thrive with a pocketful of lies? The debate deepened when he met a friend whose medical treatment had been denied by the insurance company due to a technicality. The system had rules, yes, but those rules condemned her to suffer. He helped her forge the paperwork, creating an appeal that bent the truth just enough to pass. The treatment was approved, her health returned, and she thanked him as if he had saved her life. In her eyes, he was no cheater but a hero. That was the moment he began to believe that sometimes the system itself demanded to be cheated, that morality was not obedience to structure, but loyalty to justice. And yet, even as he justified his choices, the shadow of doubt lingered. For every story where the cheat felt righteous, there was another where the cheat was selfish. The man who lied to help his sick friend seemed honorable, but the same tactic used by another to gain an undeserved scholarship felt corrupt. Where was the line? Who decided which cheats were noble and which were shameful? He thought of society as a great, tangled web of rules, some meant to protect, some meant to control, and many simply meant to preserve the power of those who had written them. To follow all rules blindly was to remain trapped. To break them recklessly was to destroy the web entirely. The truth, perhaps, was that every person had to carry their own scale of justice, weighing harm against benefit, survival against fairness. In quiet moments, he would still return to the memory of that empty parking lot, that first harmless rebellion, and ask himself whether it had been the first step toward freedom or the first stumble down a slippery slope. The world was not built on absolutes, he realized, but on compromises, on choices shaped by necessity and desire. Cheating the system could be an act of selfishness or an act of courage, a crime or a kindness, a betrayal or a lifeline. The debate never resolved itself in his mind, because perhaps it was not meant to. Perhaps the true weight of the question was not in the answer, but in the asking, in the awareness that every time he stood at the edge of a rule, he had to decide, not just whether to step over it, but what that step would make of him. He often found himself turning the question over late at night, when the world was quiet and he could hear his own thoughts as clearly as the ticking of the clock on his wall. The system was everywhere, in taxes, in healthcare, in education, in work, and everywhere it seemed to tilt toward those with more power, more money, more influence. Rules weren't neutral, he began to realize. They were written by someone for someone. If the dice were loaded before he even picked them up, was it really cheating to slip one in his favor? One evening, while waiting in line at the bank, he overheard a man boasting on the phone about how he'd moved his assets offshore to avoid paying taxes. The man laughed loudly, careless of the others around him, and declared he'd saved more in one move than most people earned in a year. No one stopped him. No one punished him. Meanwhile, the woman in front of him was denied a small loan because she'd missed a payment years ago. That was the moment it hit him like a slap. The system itself wasn't just flawed, it was selective. It punished the powerless for bending and rewarded the powerful for breaking. Still, he wrestled with the morality of it. He thought of the student who cheats on an exam. The system may be unfair. The exam may test memory instead of intelligence. But does that justify dishonesty? If the student cheats and becomes a doctor, who suffers later? He thought of companies that exploited loopholes, then collapsed and left workers jobless. Who bore the cost of their cleverness? The line between bending and breaking blurred, and every time he tried to draw it, it moved again. He remembered an old story his grandmother used to tell about a farmer who added water to his milk to sell more at the market. For years, he prospered. But when people discovered the truth, they refused to buy from him, and his reputation was destroyed. His grandmother would always end with the same phrase, "You can cheat the system, but you can't cheat trust." Back then, he'd thought it a simple fable. Now he wondered if it was the closest thing to an answer. What haunted him most was the idea of consequence. Some cheats fixed a wrong and left no scars. Others began small but grew into habits that eroded character. He knew people who had started with one false claim, one small exaggeration, and before long had built entire lives on lies. They no longer remembered where truth ended and deception began. And yet he also knew of people who bent the rules once, just once, and saved themselves or others from ruin. Their single act of rebellion became the reason a family survived, the reason a dream lived. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that cheating the system was not a single act but a spectrum. On one end was necessity, born of survival and injustice. On the other was greed, born of entitlement and selfishness. And in the vast gray space in between, every choice demanded its own reckoning. He found himself measuring his actions by the faces of those they touched. When he forged the paperwork for his friend's medical treatment, he saw her smile return, her strength return, and the guilt faded. When he adjusted the company's spreadsheet, he thought of the nameless shareholders who would lose a fraction of a percent and felt nothing. But if he imagined a coworker losing their job because of his gain, his chest tightened with unease. Perhaps morality wasn't about whether the system was cheated, but about who bore the cost when it was. Years later, when he told his children stories about his life, he left out the details of what rules he had bent. Instead, he told them the same thing again and again. The system isn't always fair. Sometimes you'll have to decide whether to obey it or outweed it. If you do cheat it, ask yourself this: are you doing it to lift someone up or just to push someone else down? The question stayed with him to the end of his life. He never claimed to find a final answer. But maybe that was the truth of it, that morality wasn't a fixed point but a conversation that lived inside a person, reshaped with every choice, every compromise, every temptation. The rules of society were written in ink, but the rules of conscience were written in shifting sand. And every time he stood at the crossroads, with the system on one side and his conscience on the other, he felt again the weight of the question that had defined him. When is it right to cheat the system, and when does it cheat us too deeply to obey? He began to notice the subtleties, the hidden layers where the system's rigidity clashed with human need. A bus driver taking a shortcut to make up lost time, a teacher overlooking a tardy student because he was hungry, a clerk letting someone skip a line because of a sick child, all were small acts of bending, technically cheating, but morally defensible. And yet, society condemned cheating, praised honesty, and rarely considered context. Perhaps the injustice wasn't in breaking the rules, but in failing to account for why someone might have no choice but to break them. He found himself drawn into debates at cafes and dinner tables, listening as others defended strict adherence to rules. Rules are rules, one friend said, otherwise chaos reigns. Another countered, but when the rules are made to favor some and punish others, isn't bending them an act of justice? He realized that cheating the system was not a single act. It was a reflection of the world's inequities, a mirror held up to society itself. Sometimes the system was unjust, sometimes it was blind, and sometimes it demanded compliance at the expense of compassion. One winter evening, he watched a news story about families losing their homes because of a technicality in paperwork. They had followed the rules, but the rules had failed them. He remembered the first time he had forged a document for his sick friend, and he understood why some people turned to deception, because the alternative was harm, suffering, even death. In that moment, the moral debate was no longer abstract. It was visceral, tied to human lives and the tangible consequences of strict compliance. Yet he also saw the dangers. A coworker had manipulated numbers to win a bonus, eventually leading to layoffs for those who depended on him. The system might have been unfair, but personal greed had amplified the harm. He understood that cheating the system was not a blanket defense. It required judgment, empathy, and a constant weighing of consequences. It was a slippery slope. One small compromise could lead to a lifetime built on deception. He began to treat his own moral decisions like a ledger, noting each choice, each act of bending, and its ripple effects. Some actions lifted others, some left scars invisible to the eye, but heavy on the heart. And he realized something profound. There was no universal rule for when it was right to cheat the system. Morality, in this sense, was a personal negotiation between necessity, harm, and conscience. Years later, he found himself mentoring a young colleague who struggled with bureaucracy at work. The young man was honest to a fault, watching promotions pass him by while others exploited loopholes. One evening, he explained his philosophy carefully. Sometimes, bending the rules is a form of survival. Sometimes it's compassion. But every time you do, consider who benefits and who suffers. The system is not always fair, but your conscience is yours alone. And that, he realized, was the essence of the debate. It was not a question with a single answer, but a perpetual negotiation, a moral compass tested daily against the shifting tides of circumstance. Cheating the system could be both a sin and a salvation, a betrayal and a kindness, depending on context, intent, and consequence. Even in his last years, he continued to grapple with the question, knowing it had no perfect resolution. But he found peace in understanding that life was not about following rules blindly or exploiting them recklessly. It was about navigating the gray space in between with care, reflection, and an awareness of the human impact of every choice. In the end, he understood that the moral debate was less about right or wrong and more about responsibility. Responsibility for one's actions, for the lives affected, and for the fragile balance between justice and mercy.